Creekside. How are you guys doing? Let's praise our Lord together. This song is called We Praise You. Join us and sing with us.
This is what heaven sounds like. We praise you. We come on. This is what living looks like. This is what freedom feels like. This is what heaven sounds like. We praise you. We praise you. This is what living looks like. This is what freedom feels like. This is what heaven sounds like. We praise you. We pray. We'll see you break down every wall. We'll watch the giants fall. If you cannot survive when we praise you, the God of breakthroughs on our side, forever lifting high. With all creation cry, God we pray. Come on, one more time. We'll see you break down every wall. We'll watch the giants fall. If you cannot survive when we praise you, the God of breakthroughs on our side, forever lifted high. With all creation cry, God we praise you. Whoa, we praise you. Whoa, we praise you. Whoa, we praise you. We praise you.
Good morning, Creekside. It's good to be back with you. I had super appreciated Derek Ewan. His teaching was phenomenal, and Kimberly Grossi likewise. And just 6 weeks of just unbelievable encouragement and and just so gifted. I've said this so many times to you. I'm so amazed by what God has done in this little church in Alamo. Just the giftedness that God has given us. I was chasing elk, emphasis on chasing, not on killing. I spent 10 days in upper mid Idaho with my son. 60 miles, 20,000 feet of elevation in 8 days. Not for the weary or the weak of heart. So that the harvesting with the animal, not successful, but the time kind of chasing the Trinity and my son and I just really bonding and hanging out was just as good as it gets. I'm home for 5 days, and then I went to Colorado with 3 of the brothers from church, Vino and Doug Abbott and Matt Lyman, and a couple of those guys were successful, so that was kind of cool. So I'm back at it from now till the end of the year. I want to embark on a 4-week series, and then I'll tell you later on what we're going to do after that. Excuse me. I want to embark on a 4-week series on truth. And really it's in regards to like what we do with truth and specifically how our sense of truth is being skewed. Most of us, I think, would agree, when we look at life right now, it's pretty disconcerting, right? And it isn't just because COVID, is happening and beating us down, although that is of course true. And it isn't just that our country and world seem to be tearing itself apart at the seams, like over things like racism and all things political. And it isn't just that the economy is being rocked by this prolonged closure. These have all clearly made 2020 unique at best, but I would say very difficult too. But something existed long before 2020. And I've said this so many times, and over the last several years, it appears that people simply can't be civil anymore. Not in my lifetime have people been so unable to simply hold a conversation or even just listen and sit with disagreement. Sociologists are actually saying now that this is the greatest divide in our country since the Civil War. So that would be the inception of the country almost. So that's a long time, and that's quite a statement. And everything seems to be made political, right? Everything's a position to hold. Everything's left. Everything's right. And maybe unique in some ways to our time, we're being stretched, I think, beyond what is familiar for a lot of us. I find people asking me things like, when are we going to meet as a church? And I'm like, we have been meeting as a church. We've had 2, drive-through worship times where over 100 people have showed up. We've had drive-through communion. We're doing all kinds of things. But I don't think people can stretch with that, honestly. I think people are waiting for us to have everything exactly like it was. And it's just not. It isn't easy to have our boundaries stretched and our values prodded at and our ideas under constant redefinition, especially when we believe as followers of Jesus that God has in fact revealed to us reliable truths. Laughably, I find myself beginning to sound like my parents' generation. And I find myself saying things like, this place is going to hell in a handbasket, or where will all this end if we keep heading down this particular direction? I'm not sure, maybe you hear yourself saying the same kinds of things as you watch the news or read things or hear discussions. Do you hear yourself saying those same things? But I must tell you, even though aspects of what we are experiencing seem unique and worse than ever, I find when I sit kind of in the ashes of our day and I linger with God and I listen and bring His Word into focus, that this isn't really as unique as we think it is. Like you guys, Lynn and I binge watch shows, and we watched a show probably a month ago called Trial by Media. I think it was on Netflix. Isn't everything on Netflix? We watched this show, Trial by Media, and really what it was showing was how the whole court scene, once it entered into the television itself, where things like the OJ trial and things like that were beginning to be piped into our family rooms, everything switched. And it was fascinating to watch these episodes one by one. One was the famous subway vigilante, if you're old enough to remember that, Bernard Goetz. If you remember, back in 1984, I was a junior in college, and Bernard Goetz, he shot 4 black people on the subway, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people protested over the racial divide. There was another episode called 41 Shots. Many of you may remember this name, Amadou Diallo. He was shot 41 times. Sounds familiar. Thousands upon thousands protested. Then in March of 1983, you might remember the Jodie Foster movie on this. I'm not recalling what the name of the movie was, but there was a woman raped in a bar in New Bedford, Massachusetts by 4 men, but while 20 or so other men watched. And it was the first trial I don't know what you would say, published, if you will, on television by CNN. Tens of thousands of people protested in the Portuguese community because the men in the bar were all Portuguese. And then tens of thousands protested against the Portuguese community in that particular scene. All racially dividing, protested by tens of thousands of people. I guess what I'm trying to say is, or maybe asking is this really that new in some ways? Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 9 says this, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. The world has been tearing itself apart for millennia. And I would suggest the difference, or maybe the bigger difference and the more significant difference, the more important difference, is how the church is now reacting, not how the world is acting. T.S. Eliot in 1934 said this, the problem of leading a Christian life in a non-Christian society is now very present to us. And as for the Christian who is not conscious of this dilemma, and he is the majority, he is becoming more and more de-Christianized by all sorts of unconscious pressure paganism holds all the most valuable advertising space. So often as believers, we are either so repulsed by our current culture that we withdraw into the safety, I think, called church, kind of avoiding all the clashing. And I think a lot of people feel like that. We just avoid saying anything now because we don't want to upset anything, because everything upsets everybody. Or we take the opposite approach. We fight and argue, trying to somehow convince people what we think. And we draw lines, we fight to hold the line on morality. C.S. Lewis had this to say, the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones that are being argued, but the ones that are being assumed. We're so fantastic, I think, at looking back at society and judging it as ridiculous and moronic, right? How on earth could they possibly have accepted this, at this particular time? It's so often our posture. C.S. Lewis refers to it as chronological snobbery. But what if the greater issue is not the darkness that is around us right now, but rather our own saturation of thought within the church from the culture that we reside in? We just recently finished a study in Paul's letter to the church in Colossae, and he gave this warning in chapter 2, verse 8. This is what he said. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit. This word captive is a passive word. It means to carry off as spoil. And what Paul is saying is, see to it that you are not just carried from your position to another place, just like your spoil, and you don't even know it's happening. Culture tells us what is normal, which is a really frightening thought. Romans 12:2 says this, do not be conformed, which is a passive word. Do not be conformed to this world, but rather be transformed, right? By the renewal of your mind, by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. If we allow the culture of the moment to define the story, rather than learn and remember the larger story that you and I are actually a part of, and it's an ancient story of God, we will completely go against our image-bearing DNA, and we will end up feeling extremely defeated. Likewise, if we act like the church does so often, which is my greater warning, contrary to how the Trinity cultivates, and we argue and try and convince and judge people rather than love and passionately create change, we will completely miss it, and we will end up angry and hateful and, equally as bad, moralizing. For followers of Jesus, our lives are not defined by the cultural moment, or at least do not need to be, nor should they be. We belong to a way grander story than that, and a way greater God than that. When we learn to be shaped by God's larger story, then and only then will we see clearly within the culture. Jesus said this in John 17:15, I do not ask, Father, that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them, make them holy, separate them in truth. Your word is truth. Is it possible, dear bride of Christ, that we are being actually influenced by the evil one and we're not even aware of it? Is it possible that the atheistic approach that our culture and quite frankly our country are saturated in is creeping into our own thinking? Is it possible that we actually are doing the same thing the world is doing, just from the other angle? When we say that we stand on the truth, I wonder sometimes what that means to each of us. How is our sense of truth actually being shaped, or dare I say, warped? How do we handle life when truth seems to be in competition with itself? Meaning, we hear something, and I find this all the time, like if I'm listening to a podcast, we hear something and it makes perfect sense to us, and we buy into it. And then we hear something that sounds like a competing argument, and that also makes sense and sounds true, and now we don't know which direction to turn. And are all truths actually equal anyway? I want to take just a few weeks to process this together. And what we're going to do in these first 2 weeks, it'll be kind of cool and unique. I want to start by interviewing one of our teaching elders who has become something of, I would say, an expert in grasping the thinking of our current age. And with that, how this might be shaping the thinking of the church without most of us even being aware it's happening. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm here with Brian Fuery, who's one of our teaching elders at Creekside Community Church. So thanks so much for taking your time to do this. This is going to seem like a weird place to start, but I want to have you help me and the church understand how the church is being influenced by the culture around us, rather than God and rather than His truth. And I think how we think we're on the right track, but we're really way off track. There's this, I shared this with you, I think before, there's this ancient Chinese proverb that I read once. It says, if you want to know what water is like, don't ask the fish. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. Fish don't know they're wet because they're always wet. They have no idea. And to me, culture is for humans what water is for fish, I think. I think we're so used to being in the culture, having the thought process, the approach of the culture come at us. We're so immersed in the culture. We're a little bit like the frog in the boiling pot. Starts out nice and slow, but I think we're all being kind of cooked to death. And now I think we're responding, thinking, acting like the culture, and we don't even know we're doing it because we think it's Christianity.
Right.
So what I want to do, and we'll be splitting this up over 2 weeks, but I essentially want to ask you 3 questions.
Okay.
We're going to dive into each a lot, but I want to ask you 3 questions. I want you to help me and the church understand the foundation of atheism itself. Then I want you to help us understand how atheism and individualism, this idea of autonomy and individualism, how they work side by side. And then eventually we'll get to the real question that I think we really want to ask, which is, okay, That's all great, but what does that have to do with the church? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, so so let's start with this first question, because you've become kind of a resident expert on atheism. I know you probably wouldn't refer to yourself that way, but you've got a blog, Confessions of a Christian Atheist. You and I have done podcasts, probably 8 or 10 of them so far. They haven't been published yet. You have a lot of atheist friends that for probably the last 10 years, you were raised by atheists.
Right.
So you have a lot of
background.
You have a PhD in atheism.
And that's religion.
Yes.
I'll call it that.
So let's start with the first question. How would you describe kind of the foundation of atheism and its approach to truth and life? And I guess maybe first part of that question is kind of just the history of atheism.
Sure. Atheism came out of the Enlightenment. I mean, there have been atheists since the beginning of time, but atheism of our day came out of what's called the Enlightenment, which is this huge scientific advancement that has happened over the last 300 years, starting with Galileo, Copernicus, maybe you're talking 500 years. Newton did a huge advancements, really created physics, the physics that we rely upon today, by which we ultimately get a cell phone out of.
Right.
And so these guys, what's interesting about them is they were simply discovering things in the universe that were reality, and the answer prior to 1500 of why does the sun rise in the east and set in the west is because God did that. Why did the trees bloom in the spring? Because God did that. Why, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. God did all this. So that was the answer. That's the church's answer.
For millennia.
Exactly. That was the answer. And even if you believed in different gods, that was the answer. So then Galileo and Copernicus start to say, well, wait a minute, the earth actually isn't the center of the universe, which the church had a huge problem with. And they discovered what's happening in the cosmos. Newton discovers this thing called gravity, the famous story of the apple hitting him on the head. So, and he proves mathematically what's going on, and it sort of launches physics. So that's, 1500s, 1600, into the 1700s. By the 1800s, you have what I would call the application of physics and science to real life. If you lived in 1820, other than clothing, you really wouldn't distinguish life between 1820 and 3000 BC. If you want to move from one place to another, you get an ox or a horse and you hitch them to a wagon and you move. If you want to get water out of the ground, you dig a well and you figure out a way to get the well water out.
Right.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
1820. So by 1880, which is when my favorite character, Nietzsche, was most famous. By 1880, you have trains to take you across country in about 4 to 5 days. It used to take 3 months, and it was very dangerous. Now you're in this iron carriage, and it's very safe. You're there in 4 or 5 days. You have a telegraph to communicate to your relatives who migrated out to California from the East Coast. You have a light bulb, you have electricity, you have very, very
Steel.
early beginnings, you have a combustion engine, you have skyscrapers going up. So if you lived in 1880 and you were born in 1820, you're 60 years old and you're going, oh my goodness. And that is different from 4,000 years previous. That's pretty much no change. So that's what these scientists did. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, a whole bunch of others. Most of them believed in God, because they discovered scientific facts.
You're saying in that period between, say, 1500 to 1800?
Exactly, until sometime in the 1800s. There were some atheists prior to them, but it got really big, especially around Nietzsche and the late 1800s, because then the philosophers who weren't scientists started to look at science and what it had done to life, and they go, we don't need God to tell us how the sun rises anymore. We don't need God to help us figure out how to get from one place to another. We don't need God to figure out, why flowers bloom in the spring.
Right.
We don't need God. And so Nietzsche has that famous statement, God is dead. Because God is no longer needed, because by the 1880s, they were saying, I think it was the World's Fair of 1890, they said everything that has ever been discovered, ever could be discovered, has been discovered, and science can go no further. That was before the automobile was really a big deal. Mm-hmm. And so, this is the arrogance of modern science.
Right.
What we have today, we don't need God. So that's the roots of atheism. how, if you want me to keep talking, I'll tell you
Yeah.
why we're living in sort of a hyper-atheism now.
Yeah.
So all this whole period of time where you have Nietzsche, he lives in Europe, and you have American philosophers who are atheists, and people are reading books and thinking about it, and, well, is God dead? Is not. Actually, the United States was a very Christian country. The United States, the Constitution, what the founding fathers believed is it's one nation under God. So this is a nation formed on Christian principles. And by the way, a Christian, very basic Christian principle is you don't have to believe in God. So this, from its beginnings, it was a pluralist society because we allowed people to not believe in God because that's part of the process.
Right.
So, but it's based on Christian values. So then you fast forward, you live through this growing atheism that's coming into...
So let me pause you. So you have this period of time where a sense of God, doesn't even matter which God you think it is ruling the universe, or they are ruling the universe. 1500s or so, science comes in,
right?
But there's still and I'm making sure I understand. There's an overlay of Christian value, Christian principle, Christian sense of Christian ethics, civil rights, if you will, which really came out of the Old Testament, and science. So what you're saying is science and Christianity actually were able to sit side by side.
Side by side. In fact, most of those scientists realized once they've realized what they could know, they realized the vast amount of what they did not know. They actually expanded their minds into realizing how much they did not know. Not just that the sun rose in the east and set in the west. No, when they started to discover physics, they realized the marvel of creation. Even people like Einstein, who started as an atheist and then starts to discover the physics discoveries that he has, and he goes, oh my.
Yeah, he was a deist.
He became a deist. He says, there has to be a God.
Wow.
So, but what happened was...
But that's a big shift in the 1800s.
But what happened was the philosophers took over science. See, the philosophers who really don't know scientific discovery or the wonder of it...
Would you call Nietzsche a philosopher?
Absolutely he was. He had no scientific background. But they used science to philosophize that there is no God. We have science. We don't need God anymore. And so it's really the early marrying between philosophy and science. There should be no marrying between philosophy and science. They're simply scientific discovery. They're the facts of the universe. And the philosophers kind of grabbed onto it and used it to drive their philosophy into what they determined to be atheism.
Wow.
So culture in the United States, what happened is this has been growing until about 1960, and the atheists won the battle in the Supreme Court to remove prayer from schools. I don't think it's that big a deal whether we have a secular person pray with my kids in school. It's, But it was a move on this country to move from Christian values to what they thought was neutral values.
Pure science.
Yeah, pure, or just philosophically, we'll just be neutral. We will no longer talk about God. Even though everything that holds our society together is about God.
So it's the subtlety of Nietzsche saying God is dead, when really it's almost we'll just make him irrelevant.
That's right. And to me, I like to speak poetically. Nietzsche declared God is dead in 1875, then he finally killed him in 1960.
Interesting.
In 1961. And really, that's when the United States moved from a Christian-oriented nation, we would say a secular. It wasn't secular. It was an atheist move. It was switching the God of the Bible to the no-God God.
So
we believe there is no God.
So we went from Christianity to Christianity and science,
right,
to science and philosophy.
That's right.
Which you're calling it philosophy, and what you're really saying is the religion of atheism.
Right, because I would say it was science foundation, philosophical thought, and then it went to philosophy that is using science. Yeah. We are driven by the philosophy of atheism today.
I've heard you talk about many times. You quote it more than anything whenever I read your material, your blog about atheism, whenever I've done the podcast with you, whenever you and I have just talked for hundreds of hours about it. Romans 1 seems to be the place that you camp.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, I think it sort of describes where our society's at. Let me look. Romans 1:28 is one verse. And And I'll read you, Romans 1, here it is, 1:28. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind. And we can talk about that in a minute. It's a mind that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Romans, a little bit before that, what people do is in Romans 1:21, it says, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations and their foolish heart was darkened.
Wow.
And the word futile, it means meaningless. And I love that.
Irrelevant.
It means irrelevant. And this is exactly what atheists have done. They didn't view God as something to be regarded any longer. We don't need God anymore.
We've got answers.
So their thinking became futile. Their thinking became meaningless.
Wow.
And then 7 verses later in 28, it says they then developed a depraved mind, which is a mind that doesn't even work. It's a mind that says, well, by gum, the Big Bang happened, and it was an atheist Big Bang. There is no God. The Big Bang happened all by itself. Well, you dig into the physics of that and you go, well, that actually violates physics. Actually, the most scientifically plausible theory for the Big Bang is that God made it happen and then started it and then it went on its own.
So at the risk
it's actually more scientific to say that God created the universe than to say that there was no God. Scientific. That's a science statement, not a faith statement.
So at the risk of putting you really on the spot, I'm going to really put you on the spot. Are you saying you don't believe in the theory of the Big Bang, or are you saying something different?
Big Bang absolutely happened. I believe in science, and science makes it very clear there was a Big Bang.
So what are you saying that you don't agree with the philosophy behind?
But the problem was, and you can corner any scientist and any biologist on this. The problem is there's an infinitesimal period of time before the Big Bang when there was absolute nothing. So there was a beginning of time and there was an absolute nothing. There was no space and time. There was just nothingness. And all of a sudden, there was everything. There was all matter, all energy, all space, all time.
From nothing.
And then the Big Bang happened. So there was absolute nothing, then absolute everything, and then the Big Bang. And so from the absolute everything to the Big Bang, we can just stick with science. We don't even have to talk about God. Because it's very clear. Well, you do, because there's all kinds of order. But in general, I'm in complete agreement with scientists, atheistic scientists. What are you going to do with that period of time when there was absolute nothing? And
how did you get to absolute everything?
Exactly. It breaks physics. It violates the physics they say they depend upon.
Interesting.
This is the depraved mind. This is the mind that doesn't work. This is the mind that the scientist looks at that and goes, yeah, it makes sense to me. But your mind's not working. That makes no sense.
You would almost call that a faith.
Absolutely.
A religion, if you will.
Absolutely.
Because you're believing something that you cannot prove.
Yeah. Well, the faith part, I would say it's absolute faith. You believe by absolute faith that everything's spontaneously generated in the universe, all by itself without any help outside the universe. That takes huge faith to say that. The religion part of the atheist comes out in our schools. Because if you try to defy the atheism behind the religion, and you try to say, boy, that Planck's epoch, that period of time where everything was nothing, and then there was nothing, and there was everything, sounds like God. If you say that, and you're a college professor, you lose your job. If you say that and you're a biology teacher in high school, you either lose your job or you go before the school board. Right. So that's a religion. That's the Catholic Church saying to Copernicus and Galileo, you're a heretic. That's, Harvard saying to a professor that says that, you're a heretic. You're violating our philosophy. The science is showing that there has to be something. It's scientific to say that. But the religion of atheism says you're a heretic and you need to lose your job.
And it's interesting, Brian. I had never made this correlation. That's where you would say the philosophy of the 1800s married itself to the science. Mm-hmm. And really, I think what you're saying is really masqueraded as the same thing.
Exactly right.
That's fascinating.
Exactly right. Atheism wedded itself to science. And the church kind of asked for it, at least back to the 1500s, because they rejected Copernicus and Galileo, who were correct.
Right.
And because their philosophy at the time, those two guys, and others were finding that the universe was not according to their philosophy. and they rejected those two.
So the
lines.
church was afraid that the slope, that the front line was slipping,
That's exactly right.
and they thought we
Well
got to
said.
hold the line, so we'll reject science
Right.
to hold the Christian line,
Right.
which they never had to do to begin with,
Right.
because the Bible's not a science book to begin with.
Right. But the church in the 1500s actually violated Romans 1 as well. Back then they violated. It says, God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen through that which has been made. So that to me is an instruction to a Christian says, science is real and it's the fingerprints of God. Don't be afraid of it.
Right.
Don't be afraid of it. You find something like there's parts of evolution that you disagree with, seems to disagree with the Bible. Don't be
It's
afraid of it.
explaining part of the magnificence of God to us.
Exactly. And there may be mysteries in science that are not quite fitting into what our interpretation of the Bible is. That's okay.
Wow.
That's okay. If it's true science, it's okay.
You're calling atheism a faith, though.
Absolutely. Faith and a religion.
Wow. And how would an atheist react to that comment? I can't
Well, go to my Facebook page. You'll see how they react.
believe. Right.
Not well.
Wow.
Not well. I mean, my favorite are I think one I just read recently says, you're no more intelligent than a cartoon character. I thought, oh, that's good. To which I responded, well, that was funny. That was kind of clever. There's no real argument there.
Right.
I noticed that you avoid actually
You did a good
providing,
job of calling me a name. but
any intelligent argument. But so I think you proved my point.
I think
but,
the question is which cartoon character.
yeah, I know. Who would I like to be? I like the Roadrunner.
So just real quickly before we move on to the next question, then, what's your thinking on evolution then?
So it's a little stickier. I'll give you a Reader's Digest version.
Sure.
I have a 5-part series coming out on my blog in the next week or
Excellent.
so.
Excellent.
On evolution, and it's important to read all 5 because there's some pushes on atheism and there's some pushes on the church as well.
Having read them all, I totally agree.
Yeah, but I stand on the ground that if science, real science, is telling me something, I need to accept it.
Right.
And I need to just simply live with the tension that it may not fit exactly with what I understand of the Bible. And I come from a background of, almost fundamentalist. That was kind of how I was raised in the church, 6 days, and they're 24-hour days. And I addressed that in the blog. A day means a period of time. I've talked about it before, I think, on my podcast. In researching for the 5-part series, I found something that I had never seen before. And you look at the 6 days, and I've noticed this all along in the 6 days of Genesis 1. It's all very progressive. It does sound evolutionary-ish.
Yeah.
It starts from gases. It starts from darkness, and then it evolves. Then there's things happening in the heavens.
Right.
Nothing happening on Earth, and then life starts to. It's first in the sea. That's what evolution says.
Yeah, it's your way of saying there's room in the text.
There seems to be room in the text. What was fascinating to me as I looked at it again, because everybody said, well, God made the animals. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, actually, God didn't make the animals. If you just read Genesis, He told the earth to make the animals. He said, let the earth bring forth the animals. Kind of like He told Adam and Eve, go make babies.
Yeah.
And so do we say a human being is made by God? Of course we do, because the design and everything, that God is infusing Himself into the process. But he had humankind work with Him on that.
But the philosophy layered over atheism, the philosophy of atheism and the religion of atheism layered over science kind of talks about it being self-generated.
That's correct, and that's where I disagree, because that can't happen. Right. And I don't need the Bible to tell the atheist that can't happen.
No, it's the second law of thermodynamics.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
You just need physics. So again, atheism starts with, I don't consider God worthwhile acknowledging anymore. And then I really ignore Him. That's the way Romans progresses. And what they end up with is a mind that doesn't work. So a mind that is faced with science and doesn't feel the tension of, the science I say I believe in isn't actually scientific at all, but I'm still okay with it.
So you would add it to the great world religions.
I would.
Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, atheism.
I would add it absolutely. Wow. And in the West, it is the predominant religion.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me take you to the second question then. So that's kind of the roots, the history, the foundation of what took place between science, the birth of science, the coexistence with Christianity, for 300 years, and then Christianity throws the science out, unfortunately, and philosophy layers itself on top of the science.
Right.
We've spoken about this idea, and I want to make a slight shift then. We talk about this idea of individualism a lot in our church. I've preached on it a ton. You and I have talked about it a ton. I do believe individualism, the idea of individualism, is the most pervasive problem we have in the West, particularly in the United States. There's a sociologist, a very well-known sociologist, who amongst 4 other authors wrote this book called Habits of the Heart. I've quoted it before. It was a really insightful book. He had this to say. He said, "We believe in the dignity of the individual." He's speaking of kind of Americans, if you will. "Anything that would violate our right to think for ourselves, judge for ourselves, make our own decisions," again, you can feel a fist coming down, "live our lives as we see fit is not morally wrong." He says it is sacrilegious. It's the idea that we have the inalienable right where we are free from receiving or coming under the authority or direction of another, including God. Individualism is the idea that the individual is then independent and self-reliant. So you're saying atheism is the religion of our world,
Correct.
of the West,
Right.
particularly of our country. And individualism is the pervasive thought.
Well, what you read there is dripping with atheist thought, dripping with it.
Tell me about that.
Well, Henley said it in the 1880s, another atheist, wrote a poem and it ended with, "I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul."
Yeah, I've always hated
So
that
of course, it's a horrible line. Captain of his soul. And again, it's a depraved mind. It's a mind that doesn't even make sense. Captain of his soul, as I said in my blog on the topic, well, surely you can just go ask him about that because surely he still lives because he's captain of his soul. He wouldn't have his soul die. Nobody would actually opt for that.
Wow.
So, the fact he's not here proves his statement to be a lie.
Right.
That kind of delusion that you read works as long as you don't have a terminal diagnosis. You can delude yourself until you get the cancer diagnosis.
Right.
Then you're not exactly master of your own fate.
You called it hyper-individualism.
It's hyper-individualism. So, and think of what is an individual? They are an island unto themselves. What is Christianity? We are part of a community. First of all, I am one with God. I am one with the Trinity. I'm part of them. I'm an heir with Christ, which makes me family with him.
Birthed out of their
Exactly.
nature.
And then it says, throughout Romans, it says that he placed us into families. He put us actually with a mother and a father and siblings.
Right.
So this was our first community. And then our church community becomes our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so just even in terms of isolationism, Christianity is the opposite of
There's
what
not
you
an
described.
element in our faith that is
because
supposed
we're
to be.
part of one another. We're the body of Christ. We're so intertwined, we're actually part of the same body. I don't know that you can get more intertwined than that.
Right.
And so it is just, at so many foundational points, it's the opposite of Christianity. So how does individualism come into our society that started Christian?
Exactly.
Well, again, since the early 60s, this has really been becoming an atheist nation, trading the God of the Bible for the no-God God of atheism, not going from Christianity to neutrality, going from one God to another God, going from the Christian God to the no-God God. So what does the no-God God say? There is no God. You got here by chance. When you die, you simply evaporate and go back to the dust. And so what does the middle mean? I mean, the beginning is meaningless because you're here by chance. The end is meaningless because you don't exist anymore. So what's the middle?
Yeah.
Well, it would the only thing it could possibly be is equally meaningless. It was meaningless in the beginning. It was meaningless in the end. That makes everything in the middle meaningless.
So how does that feed individualism then?
Well, if everything is meaningless, but I'm here, I have a pulse, I like to eat, I like to have sex, I like to party, I can have pleasure. So what meaning is there in life? Pleasure.
This might hit too close to home, but I can take whatever I want. I can move into
That's correct.
downtown Seattle. I can steal
right.
someone's property.
Because that brings me pleasure. Because if it's all meaningless, the only thing to do here is to seek pleasure. Right. And actually, the Apostle Paul, I love the guy, he just looked at it rationally and he said, look, if Christ is not raised, in other words, if Christianity is a joke and there really is no Christian God, then let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
In other words, be an atheist.
Exactly. And he wouldn't call it atheism.
Be an individualist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And eat, drink, and be merry mean that's what I'm going to do.
Take care of
I'm
yourself.
going to eat. And by the way, if you don't have enough to eat, well, it doesn't matter. I want to eat.
Yeah.
Because that's what a meaningless existence
Yeah.
ultimately does. And so ultimately, atheism and its neighboring philosopher, who was supposedly a scientist, was Darwin, who comes up with this idea of survival of the fittest. Ultimately, that's where atheism will lead us. It will lead us to brute force. Because if everything's meaningless and my pleasure as an individual is the only thing that matters, then if I can take what you have to make me have more pleasure, actually I am fulfilling the religion of atheism. I'm doing exactly what an atheist is supposed to do.
It's interesting, though. It's under the guise of something that sounds embarrassingly okay. Mm-hmm. In other words, fighting for my rights.
Right.
I have the right to this, I have the right to that. You don't have the right to come into my house. You don't have the right to take my stuff. You don't have the... It sounds very good.
Right.
Doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
On the surface?
I'm an individual. I have
my
rights.
freedom is what matters.
Right.
And
when my freedom oversteps yours, that shouldn't matter. And the problem is we're not quite there yet. Every atheist I would know would fight me on that whole thing. Well, no, you need to live according to do no harm.
They sound like lousy atheists.
That's precisely what I call them. I said, stop stealing morals from Christianity, because atheism doesn't give you that. The only logic behind atheism is take what you want to be pleasurable. And part of, we're living in a time period. So I'm 61. So I was 2 when the Supreme Court made that decision and when this country started to shift into the atheist God. And so it's been kind of through my lifetime. So people that I've known that are more my age, they're still fighting Christianity. So the debates are, well, I'm moral and you can't say I'm not moral. I'm a good person. And it's like, I know you are. I wouldn't be friends with you if you weren't.
Right.
But you keep stealing morals from me. You didn't get good morals from atheism. But here's what we're seeing now in society is I'm 60, so I have kids and now grandkids. So I'm 2 generations away, potentially, from what's happening today. So this is 2 generations that have been not taught Christian morals. Most of them never heard about Jesus Christ. Yeah. So they have no reason. All they've been taught is atheism, and they're smart. Guess what smart people do with a meaningless world? They try to get meaning through their own pleasure. And they don't have Christianity fighting, and they don't also see any value in adopting Christian morals. Yeah. Why would you do such a thing?
And yet, life is showing that it's not working at the same time. Keller wrote a book not that long ago on kind of making sense of God in hardship.
Yeah.
And he outlines kind of the 5 kind of world religions, if you will. He doesn't outline necessarily atheism as the 6th, but I think he does in an indirect way by saying there's nobody more unable to handle hardship and suffering than the people of the West, because their faith has no answer.
Has no answers.
I mean, Buddhism has an answer. It doesn't matter whether you agree with it or not. I mean, Islam has an answer. Fight back and do this and that. Christianity Judaism has an answer. Atheism has no answer to hardship because there is no meaning.
There is no meaning.
And I just heard the statistic just from a pastor in Oregon. Oregon, the number 1 cause of death under the age of 50 now is suicide. I mean,
it's awful.
Think about that.
Yeah, it's awful. That life becomes that painful.
It's and meaningless.
Right.
Even though you're making life about yourself.
Yeah.
Even though you're fighting for your rights, right?
But there was something about Jesus and what he said, if you want to have life, then give your life away. There was something deeply philosophical about that works even for the non-Christian, actually.
Yeah. The
There's something
principles of God.
human, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter whether you're a believer
Right.
or not, they're going to work.
So the atheist believes they are finding that this is what Nietzsche believed. He wanted to find the true human. He called it the Übermensch, which is basically Superman. And that means let go of all Christian morals and all Christian ideas and become truly human. Well, that's what we're seeing in society today.
Yeah.
And what is truly human without acknowledging the spiritual side of humanity, it's empty.
Yeah,
and it's painful.
Sociologists are now actually saying this is the greatest divide in humanity since the Civil War
Yeah,
in our country.
in our culture, yeah.
That's like the entire span of our country.
Polarism, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Even though
you
we're
have three
fighting
di-
for rights, fighting for tolerance, fighting for freedom.
And what was different actually in the Civil War times, you had two factions that identified themselves as a nation. You actually had two nations.
Yeah.
Today you have potentially 350 million people who identify themselves as 350 million individuals. People who say, I think there's civil war coming. I'm thinking, who's going to fight with who? There's no sense of nation. It's going to be 300. It's anarchy. It's just, to me, anyway.
And these are the terms I hear now.
Too much for me.
Being right, winning an argument, holding your ground, pushing your cause over another, right?
Yeah. All
Even
individual.
if it breaks community. It's kind of,
All individualistic.
yeah. So, wow. That's heavy.
Yeah. It's tragic to see. I mean, it's painful to see.
Right.
What a terrible statistic you just gave about
Right.
Oregon. It's hard to see, hard to watch.
There is a sound I love to hear, the sound of a Savior's robe as he walks into the room where people pray, where we hear praise and see his face. There is a sound I love to hear. It's the sound of a Savior's robe as he walks into the room where people pray, where we hear praise and see his face. You hear our cry. Awake my soul and sing his praise aloud, sing his praise aloud. Oh, awake my soul and sing his praise aloud, sing his praise aloud. There is a sound that changes things, the sound of his people on their knees. Awake, girl, you Sing his praise aloud. Oh, wake my soul and sing his praise aloud.